Have you ever wondered why the Axis powers, despite their early successes, lost World War II? It's a question that has intrigued historians for years, and today we're going to delve into it. We'll be exploring the 10 main reasons that led to the downfall of Germany, Italy, and Japan, collectively known as the Axis powers, in World War II. From overextension of resources to the failed invasion of the Soviet Union, we'll dissect each reason in detail. So let's dive into the history and unravel the reasons behind their downfall. The first reason we're going to discuss is the overextension of resources. You see, the Axis powers, in their bid for world domination, took on more than they could handle. They were fighting on multiple fronts, and that's no small task. Imagine trying to juggle balls while riding a unicycle. It's a Herculean task, to say the least. Germany, Italy, and Japan found themselves stretched thin, both militarily and economically. Their armies were dispersed, fighting in divergent theaters of war. This meant their forces were diluted and less potent. Economically, they were investing heavily in war machinery, military manpower, and logistical support. The pressure on their economies was immense, and it wasn't sustainable. This overextension had a draining effect. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a gaping hole. The more they poured in, the more they lost. The ripple effects of this overextension were felt throughout their military and economic structures, so biting off more than they could chew was the first nail in the coffin for the Axis powers. Next up, we have the failure of diplomacy. The Axis powers, namely Germany, Italy, and Japan, made a critical error in their war strategy. They failed to maintain strong diplomatic ties with potential allies. This lapse in diplomacy left them isolated on the global stage, fighting against a united front of nations with no allies to call upon for support. Germany's aggressive expansion and disregard for international treaties alienated potential allies. Italy's wavering loyalties did little to inspire trust among other nations. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor not only brought the United States into the war, but also severely damaged its diplomatic relations. In the face of such a united opposition, the Axis powers found themselves outnumbered and outmatched. This diplomatic failure was a significant factor in their eventual defeat. They had the military might, but without the crucial element of diplomacy, they were fighting a losing battle. In the world of war, diplomacy is as important as military strength, a lesson the Axis powers learned the hard way. The third reason for the Axis' downfall was their lack of technological innovation. During World War II, technology played a crucial role. The Allies, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, were at the forefront of technological advancements. From radar systems that could detect enemy aircraft to the development of the atomic bomb, their innovation gave them a significant advantage. On the other hand, the Axis powers lagged behind. Despite some initial advancements in rocketry and jet aircraft by Germany, they failed to capitalize on these technologies effectively. They were unable to match the Allies' pace of innovation, and this disparity became more apparent as the war progressed. Technological superiority allowed the Allies to strategize better, execute more efficient attacks, and ultimately, tip the scales in their favor. The Axis' inability to compete technologically significantly contributed to their downfall. As we can see, staying ahead in technology can be a game changer in warfare. Moving on, let's discuss the fourth reason: poor leadership and strategy. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, made a series of strategic blunders that cost them dearly. Germany's decision to open a two-front war, for instance, not only stretched their resources thin, but also created more enemies than they could effectively manage. Meanwhile, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor forced the United States, a sleeping giant, into the war against them. In addition to these strategic errors, there was also the issue of leadership. The leaders of the Axis powers, such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, were known for their dictatorial styles, often overruling their military advisors and making decisions based on ideology rather than strategic considerations. This resulted in missed opportunities and costly mistakes that could have been avoided with a more balanced and informed decision-making process. Thus, poor strategic choices and leadership were a significant factor in the downfall of the Axis. The fifth reason is the superior resources and production of the Allies. When it comes to war, resources and production capabilities really matter. The Allies had a significant advantage here. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, among others, had vast resources at their disposal. The United States, often dubbed the arsenal of democracy, was able to convert its massive industrial capacity to war production, churning out an astonishing number of tanks, planes, and ships. Similarly, the Soviet Union ramped up its production, despite the devastation of its western territories. The United Kingdom, although under severe pressure, managed to keep its production lines running, supplying not only its own forces but also those of its allies. The Axis powers, on the other hand, struggled to match this level of output. They simply could not compete with the industrial might of the Allies. Indeed, the war was not just a battle of soldiers but also a battle of factories. The sixth reason we're discussing is the heavy human cost the Axis powers had to bear. The toll of war is not only measured in resources and territories lost, but also in the countless lives that were extinguished. For the Axis powers, the loss of life was both staggering and debilitating. Millions of their citizens, many of whom were young men in the prime of their lives, were killed on the front lines. This massive loss of life had a profound impact on these countries' ability to continue the war. As their populations dwindled, so too did their labor force and military manpower. Bereft of the human resources necessary to sustain their war efforts, their strength waned. It was a cycle of attrition that they could not break out of. The war had consumed their people, and without people there is no war. The human cost of the war was a heavy burden that the Axis powers couldn't bear. The seventh reason is the entry of the United States into the war. Despite initial hesitations, the U.S. eventually joined the Allies in December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor. With its vast resources and manpower, the United States was a force to be reckoned with. In a world where war had become a game of resources and production, the U.S. was a titan. It was not just the military might, but the economic strength that the U.S. brought to the table. The Axis powers, already stretched thin, found themselves up against an opponent who could outproduce and outman them. The entry of the United States into the war marked a significant shift in the balance of power. It was the moment when the scales tipped irrevocably in favor of the Allies. The entry of the U.S. was a turning point in the war that spelled doom for the Axis. The eighth reason is the failed invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, the Axis powers, led by Germany, launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Their goal? To conquer the vast Soviet territories. However, the Axis powers underestimated the resilience of the Soviet Union and the harshness of its winter. The invasion quickly turned into a quagmire, draining the Axis of valuable resources and manpower. Moreover, this invasion opened a second front for the Axis powers. Now they were fighting a two-front war, against the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. This overstretching of resources, coupled with the brutal resistance of the Soviet Red Army and the unforgiving Russian winter, led to their eventual defeat. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was a pivotal turning point in World War II. It marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. The failed invasion of the Soviet Union was a major blow to the Axis's war efforts. Now that we've discussed the main reasons, let's summarize them. We started with the overextension of resources. The Axis powers, especially Germany, stretched their resources too thin, trying to fight on multiple fronts. This led to a lack of supplies, manpower, and ultimately, a weakened position. Then, we delved into the failure of diplomacy. The Axis powers alienated potential allies and further isolated themselves on the world stage. Their aggressive tactics and disregard for international norms cost them the support they desperately needed. Next, we looked at the lack of technological innovation. While the Axis did make some significant advancements, they were ultimately outpaced by the Allies. This technological gap played a crucial role in many key battles, tipping the scales in favor of the Allies. We also examined the role of poor leadership and strategy. The Axis leaders made a series of critical mistakes, from Hitler's micromanagement of the military to Japan's miscalculations about American involvement. These errors in judgment had significant consequences. We talked about the superior Allied resources and production, the industrial might of the United States, the manpower of the Soviet Union, and the strategic positioning of the United Kingdom combined to give the Allies a significant advantage. The human cost was also a major factor. The atrocities committed by the Axis powers not only led to immense suffering, but also galvanized the Allies and resistance movements within Axis-occupied territories. We touched on the entry of the U.S. into the war. The bombing of Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the conflict, bringing with it a vast industrial and military power that tipped the balance of the war. Finally, we discussed the failed invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was a strategic blunder that cost the Axis dearly, both in terms of manpower and morale. So there you have it, the main reasons why the Axis powers lost World War II. Thank you for watching.